Well, here it is, a remake of Silent Hill 2, one of the most important horror-themed games that remains influential even today, with many games unsuccessfully copying its approach to psychological horror in interactive media and drawing the wrong lessons. Bloober Team, the developers behind the remake, have been rightfully criticized of doing exactly this thing in their previous titles, but to the surprise of many, they kinda pull it off with the remake. Well, kinda. I want to preface the rest of my usual categories of good, questionable, and bad things about the game by establishing that while I do admire and respect the original Silent Hill 2 and played it many times, it was never my favorite entry in the series. It has many flaws that got even more noticeable with time, and if I want my Silent Hill fix, I choose to play the first or third games instead. Additionally, the series started losing relevance almost 20 years ago, and the last real entry anyone took seriously released in 2012. All of this is to say that I didn't have big expectations for the remake. All I wanted it to be, if it had to exist, is a good enough reinterpretation of the original with functioning gameplay, and thankfully, it does that. Despite the fears that Bloober Team might ruin the storytelling, this does not happen. Silent Hill 2 from 2024 retells the story of the 2001 original quite well. Some of the story beats and scenes are handled better than the original, some remain on par, and a couple do feel weaker, but they are a rarity. Voice actors do a great job overall, and the script was slightly tweaked in all the right places most of the time. The look and feel of the locations is also very familiar, despite being of far higher fidelity available with the new technology. And while there are questionable things I will address a bit later, overall the experience of seeing and hearing Silent Hill is evocative of how the original game felt, enhanced by the fantastic soundtrack that has a few good new compositions, but also sadly has some odd rearrangements of the old tracks that sound worse than they used to. And while this isn't really a survival horror game, with only a couple of locations providing you with the real Metroidvania-ish exploration and non-linearity like the classic survival horror does, it is still quite fun. Melee isn't great, but to be fair, it wasn't great in the original Silent Hill 2 either. Some enemies and mechanics can be annoying, yet there are also many fun moments to experience, really cool boss fight mechanics, and in general, this is a far more exciting game to play than the original Silent Hill 2 ever was. Except this might be a problem of its own. The original title was an oddity among all the entries and was designed in contrast to the first game, with the third game then being designed to contrast the second. It was quiet, depressing, with very boring and drab locations. It felt lonely and very unlike the rest of the franchise that Silent Hill became later. The remake is loud, bombastic, with walls crashing down, lights flashing, sirens blaring, and boss fights that have several phases. There's rusty, bloody aesthetics that the original game intentionally avoided, a lot of things that got popularized by the movie. A bunch of member berries are also thrown around the locations for no real reason other than to nostalgia bait the returning fans. Because unlike something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, the game doesn't include any of these references into the story. They're only here to be either feeding the big lore of the series or to just make you go, oh, I remember this. And speaking of remembering, I remember how Silent Hill 2 was surprising in its otherness and with its story twists because it played on my expectations as a Silent Hill 1 player. This whole opening talk with Angela.
This town, there's something wrong with it? And it's not just the fog either.
Sure, this is for James as well, but it's more for the returning players who think that they know what's wrong with the town and what awaits James, only to be proven wrong later. Yet, with Silent Hill 1 still being exclusive to PlayStation 1 and no remake in sight, this experience is completely lost on new players. What said new players will also not know is how well paced and succinct the original tried to be with its story events. There were many optional locations to visit, many of which then started heated discussions on forums that also fed into the big mystique of what Silent Hill 2 became. But the main path through the game was quite straightforward. It wasn't short by the genre standards, but it didn't feel long. The remake, on the other hand, pads the gameplay so much it actually becomes tiresome. Every little segment of the original is now bigger, makes previously optional elements mandatory, and on top of that adds several new and absolutely pointless additions. The storytelling just stops for hours at a time during your first playthrough because the story itself was not changed and it stretched things to just prolong the experience. I have to give credit to the developers for making some clever choices for replays of the game, though, where some segments of the game can be outright skipped. But it's not enough, and the game is still way too long even with these skips for what it actually has to tell. Overall, Silent Hill 2 Remake simply feels like a really well-designed product to release in 2024. It does things well enough, addresses the preferences of the modern audience, and doesn't ruin anything that the original game did. But as a result, it feels like a big-budget action movie adaptation of a dramatic horror novel that loses a lot of its original appeal, a lot of nuance, a lot of subtlety, and lacks ambition or inventiveness. But it also does things really well to be entertaining and fun in its own right. So, did I like playing the game? Sure. Will I want to replay it in the future? No. Will it stand the test of time like the original game did? I doubt it, but only time will tell.